3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Nine Hole Podcast. This is your host, Ian Miller. Today, I am joined by Joseph Guzman and Adrian Lorenzo. Joseph is an MLB agent with Empowerment Sports Group. Adrian is an entrepreneur, owns multiple businesses. He is a businessman and has a good amount of time in the international operations for the Miami Marlins. So I wanted to bring these guys in here. Obviously, they have a different perspective than what I've seen in the game of baseball, what I've experienced. They have hands in and eyes in different aspects, like in player representation, Joseph and Adrian in the scouting and the development operations, all that stuff, man. So I wanted to bring you guys on. I wanted to talk a little bit about that and also talk about how tough it is for international players maybe to get to the big leagues, some of the stuff that my audience doesn't know about that process, what goes into making it to the big leagues from stuff that you guys have seen, man, and just hear about your stories, man. So, but man, I'll just pass it over. How about Joseph? Let's start with you, man. How are you doing? What's the word? How's life going right now? Like, what is the life of an MLB agent right now in season?
Hey, thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's pretty busy right now. I'm going through the college seasons; those are wrapping up. High school season will wrap up this week, and then I have all my guys in affiliate that are grinding it out here through the first month. Rookie ball is going to start here soon for those younger guys in Dominican Republic. They've been working through that too through extended. So it's definitely the landscape has changed a lot. Now that they've reduced down to 165. So there are less opportunities for those Latin American kids to be in Arizona and here in Florida, with all those things going on.
100%.
So, I appreciate you having me on. And
100%, man. Yeah, let's get into it. Adrian, what's going on with you, brother? So you were the senior director of international ops for the Marlins. You have since just recently kind of parted ways to go into some business ventures. So I wanted to definitely get your expertise and kind of your insights on what the international scouting and international process is. But man, like, what is going on with you? What's the day-to-day like, man? Like, what's going on in your world?
Like a great number of things. Quite a few in baseball and quite a few outside of baseball. So I guess what I lead with right now is I'm a full-time artist. So that's what takes up if it divided it into a pie, that would take up the biggest chunk of it. But also a growing larger chunk is baseball, right? Like just general baseball operations, things that I've been doing in more of like a private consulting capacity. That's how it's like started. That's how it had its genesis and has morphed into a bit of a larger concept with a team starting to build around it. It's an interesting concept that it's still not completely built out, but I've gotten enough proof of concept early on to kind of keep, feeding it and giving it time. And then also we have some other creative ventures that are more in the production and like series and video content, things like that.
Awesome.
As a like amplifier for people who are interested in making the kind of content that I have to make anyway for my own stuff and my own businesses. So
it's big time.
A lot going on. Yeah,
I love it.
And 8.5 months pregnant, and so we're on that trajectory as well.
Congrats, man. So any time now, dude. Just speaking to you a little bit before we jumped on. Yeah. You got the phone ready. You were ready just in case you get the call, man. I absolutely get it.
You see my eyes dart, that's where I'm just checking. So
for sure, man, that makes a ton of sense. I get it. I got a 10-month-old, actually about to be 11 months tomorrow. I don't know where time goes. So I get it. Congratulations, that's big time. So, with my experience in baseball, man, it's like I had gotten drafted. I got thrust into the minor leagues at the lowest level of the minor leagues, and then I progressed. I tried to make my way through the minor leagues, spent some time in Mexico, spent some time in Puerto Rico. So I got, I guess you could call it a little bit of international experience, more so in Mexico as opposed to being in Puerto Rico, man. So I know that, I guess you could say down there, right, in Latin American countries, like baseball is real. That was my first taste of like major league environment baseball, where I'm playing in the Mexican league and there are 25,000 fans. They got They have bands playing in between pitches. They have cheerleaders. Like, it is an insane experience. So I definitely wanted to touch on, what it's like, kind of what the process is, what the trials and tribulations are. And everybody's experience is different. Everybody kind of gets either to the big leagues or maximizes their career in a different way. Everybody's got a different trajectory. So, man, Joseph, let me just start with you. To get to this point, like, what has your journey in the game been to get to where you're at right now? So obviously, like, you are an MLB agent and you are representing, international and American players in the draft, right? Like, how'd you get here, man? What's the story?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a long journey. I grew up in New York. My dad was very passionate about baseball. He played with Sean Dunston and a bunch of other guys that ended up playing in the big leagues. His thing was that his defense wasn't as good as his pitching and his hitting was. And so he had an opportunity to sign with the Padres. He turned it down because my mom had my sister on the way. So he had another job lined up. And he really is the one that instilled the passion of baseball. To me, growing up in New York, there's a lot of Dominicans, Puerto Ricans that I grew up with, and we'd just go outside and play wiffle ball. My dad would play softball, and we'd be out there for hours, just swinging the bat and doing things. And I always had a passion for the game. And when I was 15, we were fortunate enough, my dad got a transfer here to South Florida. Played high school here at Sagemont with Tommy Martinez. He had some time in pro ball, really good coach, showed me a lot of things, really helped me with my hitting. Had a really good senior year. I was a shortstop for 3 years there, and played against a lot of big leaguers. Michael Taylor was in our district, Luke Jackson, was Taylor Gushu, several
Taylor.
guys. Yeah, and
I know Gush.
yeah, so we played against them in high school. I went to Tennessee Wesleyan out of high school, and a good program. Didn't get too much playing time. Ended up coming back. Went to Florida Memorial. Before I got there, I redshirted. I had a red shirt that year, and I had the opportunity to go down to Dominican Republic with the Kansas City Royals and do extended spring training with them. So I have the Dominican background. I go down there, extended spring training. I do very well. And I wasn't allowed to play in their season. I wasn't allowed to sign because I didn't establish residency. Adrian could probably hit more on how all that works with the Cuban population of players that goes down there and does that. And during my time there, they were like, "Man, you should have came down here when you were 18. We would have signed you." And it's just things that you didn't know. And I just started to realize, like, being out there every day with that type of development, like, you got a lot better, right? Mm-hmm. And I took pride in player development. I was like, dude, there's opportunities for guys that have tools. They just need the right environment, right? So had a really good summer there, trained there all summer, played with Miguel Almonte. He played in the big leagues. Yordani Ventura was down there for some time training. There was several guys that ended up making it to the big leagues, and I'm still friends with today. And so I came back to Florida Memorial, had a really good year. Throughout the whole season, I had migraines, and I was playing. I had like 4 or 5 teams that showed interest. Went to a couple workouts after the season that ended up happening. And then, but I saw from that summer before, I was like, dude, like, I developed so much in this 3 months that if I can help guys find some way to develop, then there's an opportunity for these guys to make it to the next level. So that summer, I still had the migraines, went into the ER, really bad migraines for like 6, 7, 8 hours a day. And I had a cyst underneath my brain, and it was the size of a golf ball. And then when when that happened, I had surgery right here. You can see the
okay, yeah.
When that happened, that kind of changed my perspective on things. I missed the whole fall of my senior year, and I was like, you know what, whatever I get to play, I'm happy with it. This spring, and I was limited on at bats, didn't end up getting picked up. And I started coaching high school. Then I coached in the Valley League. I had an opportunity to coach up there for a couple of summers. And I started to help guys, get into college. And I'm like, I'm pretty good at this. Like, I got some guys, good universities. Like, I just really care about people in general. So I'll help anybody and everybody if they need help, right? I'm that type of person. And so I got into that, and I started, before I knew, I had a bunch of guys committed. And then an agency saw how hard I worked, and they were like, "Hey, why don't you do some scouting for us, recruiting?" And in the 4 years that I was with that agency, I had 21 draft picks and free agent signs. And that was before the reduction, right, of from 40 to 20. And then I was like, you know what? Like, I started to see that on the agency side of things, there's value, there's number signs on each player, right? This guy's in the 30th round, 40th round. Like, you don't pay much attention to him. You know, you got to pay attention only to the top guys. And I get it because the percentages are against them, but I just wanted to make sure that any guy that I represent, like, it's start to finish, you know, and I have guys that have graduated from law school, become firefighters, still have really good relationships with them. And then I ended up getting certified. I took my exam. I did all those things. And within 6 months, I was completely certified. I had a big leaguer from a really good story. He was an indie ball guy, never drafted. And that was basically the reason why I stepped away from the first agency I was with. And I just want to be able to help as many guys as I can. And I've had some good success. I'm fortunate to have been able to help so many guys.
It's beautiful, man. I love that. I love that. That fires me up. I feel that. So obviously, like, as you progress down the ladder in the draft, there's a price tag on you that diminishes the lower you get down. You're not a prospect, so you might not get the same opportunities as the big ticket guys, the guys that get money. And with that comes the treatment. So, like, I did not sign for a whole lot of money. I was not like a top 10 prospect. So, like, you get treated accordingly, man. I absolutely get it. I love what you're doing. It's fires me up to have you here, Joseph. That's awesome. Adrian, brother, what about you, man? So you spent a good amount of time international ops, dude, got up to senior director, man. Like, what was the journey like for you in getting here, man? Like, how did it all start? And was that what you wanted to be?
Was that what I wanted to be? I'll answer the rest of it. But in a sense, yes, I knew I was tethered to baseball since I have my first memories, you know? So, like, I was a Cuban kid, like a Cuban American kid born to Cuban parents, like that, you know, got to Cuba not that long before I was born. So it's like, in order to understand, like, baseball, like the cultural breakthrough for Latin America, especially certain like Cubans, Dominicans, Venezuelans, and, you know, Curacao, Colombia, and other pockets, Mexico, right? The cultural tie to baseball, it's, to me, similar like soccer is in Europe, and how American football is here in the States, right? Like, there's a more cultural tie. So it's almost like understood, you're like a Cuban kid who likes sports, you're going to play baseball, right? And so that's what I did from like age 4, and then just played as seriously as I could all the way through. Started to take it more seriously in high school. I played my high school baseball down here in Miami at Belen Jesuit. Got really serious about it during high school, had pretty decent grades. So by the time senior year rolled around, the schools that I was talking to were academically focused. That was my goal. What's the best school that I could get into and still play baseball? So, like, best school first, and then if it happened to be a Division I program that was good, then that was hitting the sweet spot. And then the University of Pennsylvania came around, like, later in the period, probably around January, before my senior year. Went to a few showcases, did okay, and was fortunate enough to get shoved into the bottom of their recruiting class. I was the guy they needed, you know, the academic indexes. I'm sure you're familiar with it, right? Like, I'll never forget his name. Well, I'll never forget the kid. I'm going to leave him off, but I needed the kid with the perfect score at the top of the class to, like,
bring the average up.
Exactly. I was bringing up the rear. But went on to the University of Pennsylvania, played my 4 years there. Mixed bag in terms of, like, success. Got there, played right away, played a lot right away, played throughout. But just never really figured it out offensively. It was always, like, tinkering throughout offensively. Had some bat to ball. I could always pick it. I could always play defense in center field and right field, and I could throw and I could run and I could help win a game, right? But I, like, offensively, I know this now as an executive or as a scout that, like, my tools were short, you know, to really impact the baseball, right? Like, but, you know, I didn't believe that until the very end. You know, you never really believe it until the very end. So,
amen.
But played my summers, never really took a job, right? Like, if you're playing, and I go back to the Miami baseball thing, if you're a kid and you decide to do this, you know, and I'm sure you deal with a lot of travel ball parents, it's like, it dominates your whole life, right? Like, I've tried I'm an artist now, right? And I like to paint and draw my whole career, or like my whole life, but baseball just kind of dominates everything in a way where it leaves very little space for you to really, go after those kinds of endeavors, which was fine to me, early. But my point is, I never really disconnected from it. Like I went from playing high school baseball to playing college baseball. I wanted to keep playing, got some interest, but like by the time senior year rolled around, my enchantment level with baseball had faded. I had grown to be a bit of a frustrated. Hitting is hard, man. Hitting is really hard. So like I had grown to get frustrated by not being able to like break through that level. That's like it's the ceiling a lot of hitters hit, right? Like you hit it and you're like, I just changeups got me. I don't know what it was. Like I could see the breaking ball okay, but the down and away changeup, I just like I didn't see that well. And so I went from playing and being, the grind of playing college sports. You're on it every day, all the time. And so from that, a week later, I was sitting in an office at an agency, actually. So I started off on your side of the ball, Joseph. So I started out at an agency called Wasserman Media Group. They're still a pretty big agency. And like a week after playing, which was it was a real shift for me, right? Like I had never had a job. It was my first time having a job. So I had to figure all that part out. While I'm like, oh man, I'm not an athlete anymore. I still have these competitive urges, this like drive, but all of a sudden, like I'm like fit and ready to go, and I have nowhere to like exert that. I started to play more basketball and things like that just to get that out, but I don't know, that realization hit me harder than, I don't know if most, but it hit me hard. And so I ended up spending the next about 2 years in Los Angeles with Wasserman doing, when I got there, I realized that they had about 50% Latin American clients. But not a whole lot of people in the office at the time were speaking Spanish. So I kind of immediately found a pocket to operate in and to help and to impact. And through two guys at that agency, really, well, an agent by the name of Adam Katz, he kind of pulled me onto his desk. And Adam had been around the game for a long time, represented guys like Sammy Sosa and like huge names in the game, and really was like at his peak during when I was there, right? And so I got there and they were handling Yoenis Cespedes pre-signing with the Oakland A's. So I kind of got there at a point in which they needed what I could provide, because I was like translating, and it offered me an opportunity to gain high-level insight into like 3 weeks into a job, like a major league free agency bonanza, because everybody was in on that process. So it went through the whole showcase process and scouting and receiving offers. And so I lived a life of like, if you guys have seen Entourage, like Ari and Lloyd, that dynamic, I was like a version of Lloyd for like 2 years.
I love that.
In some ways. It was the hardest I've worked in some ways, but it was also like I got high-level access to everything. I didn't have any business seeing that firsthand, but thanks to Adam, I got that insight. So after about 2 years of that, I wanted to get closer to the field, and I hope, I mean this with no disrespect to Joseph, but I like the agency side at that point in my career felt like I'm too far away from the grass and from being outside and from like that part. I was drawn to that always as a kid. And so an opportunity opened up with the Boston Red Sox in Fort Myers, a player development intern, like lowest affiliate totem pole, and in August in Fort Myers, if you've been there, or summer, it's not, it could
blazing
be
and lightning.
Yeah, the GCL is an interesting place during that time of year. But anyway, that was my first professional baseball opportunity. Was an internship with the Red Sox in Fort Myers, and it was exactly what you think it is. Like it's the guy who goes and picks the guys up at the airport, or at the airport in Miami to go take them to Fort Myers, but then you're on the daily shuttle to pick the guys up at the Holiday Inn Express from and take them to the complex. Right. Problem is the complex is like 30 minutes from your apartment, and you got to go get the bus to then come back, and so it's like there's an added, and everybody's got to be there by 7, right? Like players can't just be late to spring training, extended spring training. So that was my introduction to baseball, and I did a lot of video. So I was like, I had a camera, and I was that guy you see on those backfields running around from. And this was in the era before like prefix cameras, right. Everything was synced up, You had the tripod, and it's you and the tripod, and you're flipping hard drives and batteries, and you're like righty open side, lefty open side, and you're like you know, here I am with like, a degree I just paid all this money for, like just sweating my ass off.
Yeah,
on the
dude, Ivy
backfield.
League.
Yeah. But the Red Sox were like an incredible organization. I got there in 2013. I got there in April of 2013, and we won in like November of that year. So they win the World Series like as I'm there, and the Red Sox being who they are, and my boss at the time being who he is, like I got a ring from 2013. Like as soon as I got there, I got into an organization that was like at its peak, like at that point in time. So I was like really energized. I did well enough in the internship to get offered that second level of internship in Boston, so like a baseball operations internship. And then that was cool, man. That was baseball-wise, I was always a Red Sox guy. That was like Cubans are either Yankees, Red Sox, or Marlins, So I fell into the Red Sox camp, and so walking into Fenway Park every day to go to work, that was cool. Like you walk into like this little side door, and you're in, this mecca or cathedral of baseball. And I had like, all 24/7 access to this place. So I'd go, it was awesome. Cool,
it's amazing.
really cool experience, but also the hardest I've ever worked anywhere by far. Like that was a eye-opening experience as to like the hours of like what this is. Like spring training and complex life is a little different in that it's all stacked in the morning, unless you're in Arizona and you're kind of at night with the games. That's a different structure. But in spring training, like it's all stacked in really early AM. In Boston, it was all major league focused, so everything was the games are at night. So you're definitely staying for the whole game, but you're also showing up at 8 to beat everybody there. So it's like this compounding thing of like
16-hour
that
days.
year, I remember having a roommate that I'm really good homies with and friends with now during that year, but we joke about the fact that we lived together, but I never saw him. Like we never overlapped on anything because I was just, you get into the office. I had an intern duty that was placed on me from the intern before me, that you get a coffee that you bring for the assistant GM at the time. Like it was just like handed on before me and inherited from the guy beyond that. So that meant that like you had to be there before the earliest guy in the office. Damn. So it was like setting things in that, it was a year of that straight, right? And I get lucky enough that, funny enough, Yoenis Cespedes at the deadline in 2014 gets acquired by the Red Sox. So like he and I kind of reconnect through this, like at the trade deadline, and they pull me onto the major league staff to be his interpreter because I was already an intern with them at that point. Wow. So halfway through the year, I get pulled onto this major league staff experience, which was awesome as a 22-year-old kid or 24-year-old kid, whatever I was at the time. And got really close to that staff, made a good enough impression that at the end of that year, it was Mike Hazen and Allard Baird. They offered me to come back on the major league staff as what they call the major league staff assistant.
Okay.
So that was it was a uniformed position, but it was kind of a interpreter. It was definitely an interpreter. It was a replay tech. So I did the replay. This was in the second year that replay was rolled out.
Okay.
I was their replay tech. And I started out catching bullpens, but turns out I'm left-handed. Guys don't like throwing to a left-handed catcher. I don't
that makes
blame them.
sense.
It's weird. But I did that for a little while. I threw BP for like a good while until I got the thing a little bit and stopped throwing BP.
Okay.
And then,
the unspoken.
Yeah, that's a whole experience. But I got into like a major league staff role, like advanced scouting and that kind of thing. And after that year, I loved that role. I loved that job. Like there's nothing that quite calibrates you like the major league game. Like everything in our game works backwards from the major league level. Everything is really just reverse engineering it from the major league level. So the one responsibility I did have, every intern had it, we rotated it. It was, we would sit in the scout seats at Fenway, which are like about this narrow, first of all, but like you'd sit with this like electrical box on your lap. I think they've updated the tech since, but you would watch the pitch at like eye level. So the catcher's probably at your eye level, you're sitting a little lower. And based on like, okay, what the velo is and the action on the pitch was, you had to press on the little box you had fastball, cutter, slider, whatever it was, and that's what would flash on the big screen at Fenway.
Got you.
So like whatever you pressed is what came on. And it was like you couldn't mess that up. It was like a shame. It was a shameful thing to mess that up. But some guys are obvious, and some guys, like I remember John Lackey and Jake Peavy, all their pitches just kind of they all did the same thing.
Yep.
The cutter cut a little bit. The changeup faded a little bit, but it cut too. Like everything just did the same thing, and you would get like crushed via text if you were consistently getting them wrong.
That makes sense, bro.
And so. But it really it really calibrated me. So I thank that experience a lot for like having to be accountable to like a major league scale and like understanding that it all kind of funnels and functions backwards from there. So
I love that.
Tremendously impactful experience. Yeah.
That's big time, dude. That's
so
I love that.
Sorry to be long-winded on all
No.
this, but I guess it's just it's context. And at the end of that season, for some personal reasons, I kind of felt I needed to get back to South Florida, and so I expressed that to the Red Sox, and they were kind enough for their current assistant GM or executive VP Eddie Romero. He and I had a conversation, and he pulled me onto his staff after that conversation, which was he ran their international operations, both scouting and player development, and I came on. It started out as a coordinator to help him, and then it turned into his assistant director. Shortly thereafter. And so over the we covered the 2017, 2018, and the beginning of the 2019 signing classes with the Red Sox.
Sick.
We signed like 150 something players in that point in time. And I was a cross checker, so I was an evaluator. That's where I got my first real, you have to go out there and put your opinions into a system and put your for your whole organization to read and see and be right and wrong and that kind of thing. So that's where I got that first experience. And that's also where I started running around Latin America. So my primary responsibility was to be one of our cross-checkers, one of our evaluators, and scout Latin America. So that meant a week in the Dominican and a week in Venezuela, pretty much every month, and then everything in between, Curacao, Colombia, Aruba, Panama, Mexico, Brazil, anywhere that baseball is played in Latin America mostly, I've been, and usually like many times.
That's incredible, man. That's cool.
Ran around for quite a while doing that for the Red Sox.
I love it, man. That's fantastic, dude.
So that's where I cut my teeth, and then I get pulled onto the Marlins. So in this attempt to continue getting a little closer to home and getting closer to family, the opportunity with the Marlins opened up and presented itself to join their front office in it was called a special assistant to baseball ops and scouting. So it was just wore a lot of hats. It immediately started out helping to run their pro scouting department, something I had never really done, right? So it was like being introduced to this new concept and then asked to help think about how to shape it and run it. And then that ultimately led into being the director of baseball ops there for the Marlins, and that was like a bit heavier major league operations and minor league free agency and major league free agency. It was like a lot of that. I would have been the primary point of contact on, at any point, 10 or 11 clubs for like trades. So like myself and another counterpart on the Diamondbacks, let's say, those are the first discussions on any trade concept. They don't happen president to president, right? Like two people below that level hash it out and start to hash it out and feel out what could be possible and what's not. And that kind of builds the bones of any trade concept or anything that moves forward. So I would have been one of those people. And then you bring that concept to the larger group and discuss it further, but you're like the funnel back, the conduit back to whoever, because usually those president of baseball ops are handling a million things. So that's just kind of the way it gets divvied up. So that was my first real experience into the Marlins. But ironically, that year, I worked all of 2018. I joined the Marlins at the end of 2018, but I worked all of 2018 with the Red Sox. And as the postseason starts is when this Marlins opportunity comes together. So I'm leaving the Red Sox, and they're going on to win the World Series. So they win in 2018 as I'm exiting. And then we got another ring as a result of that. So that was really nice. One that I felt I had a larger part in. So I felt I had much more earned that one.
It's awesome.
Even though I worked hardest on the first one, so that's interesting. But
It's funny how it works out, huh?
yeah, and then I guess to kind of wrap us up here, toward the end of my tenure with the Marlins, I returned back to a more like a strength, right? Like a more Latin American. How can I move our Latin American operations overall moving forward? And at that point in time, around September 2021, the scouting operations were what were most, an opportunity for us to impact and move this organization, grow this organization and our operations within Latin America. We had been able to sufficiently convince the new ownership group that Latin America is an area of worthwhile, of significant investment, and that the trajectory is nothing but up. They're not making it any easier with the 165 player limits and things like that, but that's a topic we can get into at a later point. But my purpose and my drive behind doing all that was to grow the game in Latin America and give Latin American kids opportunities, as many as possible. So in the 2 years that we were running it, between signed and committed players, there will be about 120 something players that were signed as Marlins in a 3-year span. Right?
Awesome.
So like 6 drafts worth of players in about 3 classes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But it was like tactical, right? Like we, and I say we because it's a lot of people. We built a brand new academy in the Dominican Republic. I don't know if you guys have seen what that looks like, but it's in my opinion, it's one of the best. It happens to be one of the newest. So newer usually means better. And in this case, it's just like it's a baseball cathedral, if you appreciate these kinds of things. It's like an SEC Division I facility in Latin America.
Love it, man.
We really elevated the level of development, I think, and that's a huge effort by the ownership group and all those involved in making that happen and putting it together. But as we grew from 1 Dominican Summer League team to 2 teams. So we went from 35 players that are down there to 70 players that are down there. So the odds, we just doubled the operation overnight. And that was really just a copy and paste job from the Red Sox. Like I saw how functional that model was to like the volume, they got a guy playing right now, Sedan Rafaela, right? Who is like a 10K sign, who like only gets that opportunity to establish himself if there's a second team.
Gotcha.
He's either infielder number 4 on team 2, or he's infielder number 7 on team 1. Who gets playing time in that dynamic?
Yep.
So that's where that kind of thing really comes into play, and it gives you chances to develop more pitchers. So I was given the opportunity to meaningfully take hold of steering that. And I did that for 2 years until the end of October, where my art had just been bubbling side to side with baseball. I had been trying to do both at the same time for a long time. It was a very slow pull of the Band-Aid to decide to do this. But I had felt a sense of, I've done a lot in the game. Like I'm satisfied with what my contributions have been, and I'm satisfied with what these kids have opportunities moving forward, and so do the staff members and things like that. So to me, it was a comfortable time to be like, I'm going to chase this that's I'm passionate about right now. And I thought I would just sever it, and it hasn't been the case. The baseball business has bubbled, and here I am talking baseball with you guys. So
fires me
6
up,
months
man.
later. So
Fires
sorry to
me
be
up.
so long-winded, but it was context
awesome.
to get here.
That's awesome, man. I love to hear all that. So I obviously thank you boys for sharing the journey to where you're at right now. I wanted to highlight that as a way to preface the whole conversation. Like there is more to the game of baseball than just being a player. There's a whole bunch of shit that goes into it behind the scenes that people don't see, right? There's decisions being made in the scouting department, like in the player development, on the representation side, there, you're always being evaluated. There are a whole bunch of things that go into a career. There's a whole bunch of different things going on behind the scenes, different departments, man. And I love having both of you guys on from 2 different sides of that coin, right? And having different experiences, man. So it's awesome. So I wanted to touch on, the Latin American side of things, right? The international player trying to make it to the big leagues. We all know that when a player gets drafted or signed in the States, right, they sign and they probably go to an extended spring training, or if they're a little bit more advanced, maybe a short season, depending on, what the situation is. But man, like what are the struggles and the journey along the way to the big leagues that a Latin American player faces, or an international player, like however you want to dictate it. I know that you guys have some solid experience in the Latin American, culture, arena, all that stuff. Like, it's not just get drafted and then thrust into, a Midwest town that, you've never been to before, right? You're kind of like uprooting your life, your culture. You're leaving the country, unless you're in the, the DSL. I don't know if they have that anymore, right? But trying to get out of the country to get to the States, right? And then begin the journey. Like, man, Joseph, if you could just maybe elaborate on that, man. Like, what are the struggles that the international players face as opposed to the American players? Like, man, I became accustomed to it, and I kind of saw it in my first year or two in the minor leagues. I'm like, dang, dude, these guys have it a lot harder than I have it, and it not more money. Like, everything is kind of kosher. Like, these guys might sign for a little bit more money, but they got more people to take care of. They got a lot more stuff going on. They're in a different country. It's crazy, bro. So, Joseph, if you could just elaborate, man, on like what kind of struggles those international players face in getting picked up and getting drafted or signed there, right? And then making it to the big leagues. Like, what are those struggles like?
Yeah, so first I'll start off something that I left out earlier. I worked with Jeff Diskin. He's a cultural development guy for the Royals. I did like an internship there too, after college for a couple of months. And we would basically teach them English. We would teach them about the culture before they were brought to the US. We would even talk about batting averages, ERA. Like, they had no idea any of that. Like, they were like, dude, if I would have bunted 8 times, I would have hit 300. Like they just know that hitting 300 is good. Like, that's it. They know that that ERA of sub 3 is good, right? They didn't really know what that meant. So teaching them about the culture, that was cool. They're starting to integrate more of that, trying to teach them the language, helping them with their education. But now with the contraction of 165, what I'm seeing is, there's a lot less spots, right? So those guys cannot come over here to the States unless they are on a roster. So they got to be on a rookie league roster. So there's guys in Dominican right now that are stuck, that are international players, right? And that can be Bahamas, that could be Venezuela, Panama, Mexico. That could be any of these countries that those players sign. And another thing is, like, they'll sign for a lot of money, and those guys will have a little bit more leeway. They'll get more at bats. They're favored a bit more, but most of them will stay there for that year until their bonus is clear, right? Because of the taxes and all that, and they want to be closer to home. But a lot of that money that they're getting is going back to their families. Like, they're thinking about building their family a house or getting them a vehicle. Like, the view is much different. Like, they work hard for that signing bonus, and some of them, they lose interest in becoming a major league player. Maybe because their situation was so bad that when they signed, they were like, well, my family's good now. Like, I'm going to try, but if I don't succeed, and I'll go into something else. And there's players that have come to the States, and, 10 years ago, a lot of them would just leave, right? They'd just go and try to find a job or transfer their visa, and they'd leave and work anywhere just because they didn't want to go back if they've had fear of being released. They couldn't order food, they didn't know how to order food. I think that, the last probably 8 years, they've done a good job of coaching these kids and teaching them things. But even something, that I have to talk to my players about too, is like doing their taxes, right? Like, make sure we have someone competent that's doing it. Like, they're sending their social security, like some of these kids send their social security number to anybody, right? They don't know how to do their own taxes. They're sending it to some guy because, oh, my friend did it with this guy. And that's how Latin communities work, right? Like, you have a friend of a friend, and you trust them because of that friend, right? You create this loyalty, a sense of loyalty because your best friend told you that this is a good guy, right? Or their financials, right? Like, they don't know what's going on with their money, like we saw, with Ohtani going on right now. Like, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, and they don't even log into their accounts. So I try to make sure that all my guys are, they're accountable for their things, right? And they know what's going on. And we don't provide financial services for our clients for that reason. We don't want any like sticky, like, oh, we're controlling this guy's money. We have people that we refer them to if they choose to use them. That's up to them completely. But know who it is. Maybe they have to be bilingual. If that's what's important to you. You should be able to communicate and not be locked out of your account and not know what's going on. So those are a lot of those challenges that they face. They're leaving their families behind for months at a time. And now they come here. I had a situation the other day. One of my pitchers, he signed out of Nicaragua for 20K, right? And his organization, he hadn't pitched in like 8 days. The last time he pitched, he was like lights out for 4 innings. He had a phenomenal year last year. He has like 144 total innings in the minors, and he's only walked like 20 guys. And, so I had to reach out to the farm director. I was like, hey, man, he's real frustrated. He hasn't thrown, right? And he was like, okay, I'm on it, right? So then the next day he throws and he's happy again, right? Because he's lights out again. But it's just those little things that they don't understand, what's going on. They don't understand that, there are some guys ahead of them because they've been drafted or they've signed for millions, right? So they are going to get more opportunities. So kind of educating them on those things to make sure they stay level-headed and understand that you just got to do your job when you're called upon, man. And you can't control everything. That's what I'm there. It's a support, and I'm sure Adrian knows a lot more on the other side of those things too. So I'll let him take over.
I love that. Yeah, Adrian, man, like in your experience, man, being around the game, like in that culture, man, seeing the trials and tribulations, the swimming against the current, swimming uphill, like, man, what don't people see behind the scenes with these Latin American players? And would you say it's harder for a Latin American player to get signed and make it to the big leagues than a dude that gets drafted from the States? Like, what do you got on that stuff?
I don't know if harder is necessarily the wrong word. I think I might ultimately land on harder and saying yes to that. But I want to I guess I want to zoom out and preface this a little bit by saying I think speaking as a Latin American, and I think most would agree with me, nobody is asking and nobody is requesting for the bar of expectation to be lowered to any point lower than anybody else, right? But I'll start that, but with the caveat of saying, but let's also highlight the disparities of the two systems, and then you guys make your own decision as to what's uphill and what's downhill, right? Or what's fair and what's not fair, and what are obstacles that one group has to face that the other one doesn't. So I think, Joseph, you did a great job elaborating, especially what happens post signing bonus. So let's call that the professional side of the operation, right? The part that I want to reverse engineer and dissect to make people really understand where the meat of this is how broken up this process is, and how there's actually 2 more pieces that happen before any pen is put to paper that kind of outlines the difficulty of the path for any Latin American player, right? So Latin American player is eligible to sign a contract if he's established residency in a Latin American country at 16 years of age, right? If he's 16 years of age or about to be by a certain cutoff, he can sign within that class, right? In that year. So that rule was set, I don't even know, I believe it was 90s, about the age being 16. Now, at that point in time, the game was in a very different place than what it is. We have for whatever reason, call it collective bargaining, call it prioritization. That number, which I believe was sort of arbitrary at the time and feels very arbitrary now, has remained. So kids can still sign at 16 years old. So that's a fundamental difference than the American system. Even as an early signing high school player, you're talking about an 18-year-old kid who has had the opportunity to finish high school before he can even think about college or the pros. And you played pro ball. It's really stacked with college guys. It's scattered high school guys, but it's heavy college population pool. So what does that mean? That means these kids are just more mature. They're reaching levels of maturity with the combination of education before they even play pro ball, right? Now let's go to the Latin American kid. Take your average kid in the Dominican Republic who's signing on January 15th for, let's just call it a $300K bonus to not be the top guy and to not be the guy, on the bottom, right? So if you had to estimate where that guy's process starts in all this to prepare for that signing day, I think most people would be like, oh, he starts a year out, a senior year of high school or something like that. No, the odds are this kid probably stopped going to school officially probably around 10, 11 years old on a everyday go to school basis every day.
Yep.
Probably if he continued to go to school, he did so in some Saturday only capacity, right? Where you go to school on Saturdays and I guess you bunch it all into one day and you're good for the week. I'll reserve my judgments on that, but doesn't
Right.
feel great to me. But that's, to me, it's like a checking of the box to be like, yeah, I'm going to school too. Well, and all due respect to those schools in the attempt to continue the education, but for all intents and purposes, they stop their education. So you stunt the education of a young boy at this point in time at 10, 11 years old in a formal way. So hopefully he got enough from his home and school that he did get to at least establish like basic reading and writing and general comprehension,
Mhm.
and there's exceptions to every rule. There are kids with like exceptional families that go to good schools, like, but I can tell you in over 10 years of this, I can speak in generalities that feel consistently true or consistently correct, right? So now we're still at the 11, 12-year-old range of age. So there's a system in place in Latin America that looks for those aged players. And that system is not scouts of major league teams. That system is the scouting system of the individual agents, trainers, let's call them trainers just for the sake of this exercise, right? Who then showcase their players, those players, to the scouts once it's a little further down the line. Now, the major problem that we're running into in baseball is that teams are getting further and further out with how early they're scouting and committing and signing. No, well, not signing, because signing stays at 16.
Verbal, yeah.
But the verbal agreement period is like, in my opinion, has gone to an extreme recently. Like, and I can tell you this as somebody who was a participant, kind of like I don't know, it was a position of being like, you have to participate and you have to compete for players, right? Because you still are accountable to your general manager and to your front office as to bringing good players into your organization. That is your fundamental purpose, like when you're running these operations. That said, the industry has, in my opinion, just continues to get ahead of itself to the point where you're really sitting there watching 12, 13, 14-year-old kids and like filling out scouting reports. And if you're, any scout that like it fills it out knows that like, damn, that's a deep projection. Trying to project, like, I know kids that were like the best players in Miami, man, like the Babe Ruths of Miami that didn't get out of high school ball,
Yep.
but they, at those ages, they were the dude, they just, and so it like these kids and needing to show that they have like major league tools, qualities, traits, projections at 13, 14 years old opens up this like Pandora's box of people, processes to get involved to make everything infinitely more difficult. And I started with the education, right? The lack thereof of education. And this doesn't apply cleanly to every Latin American country, right? Like that's an important distinction here. Like I want to highlight that because sometimes things get grouped into Latin America. The cultural variation within Latin America from culture to culture and country to country is vast, right? Like the differences between Venezuela and Dominican Republic are tremendous, just like ethnic differences, cultural differences, style of Spanish, just viewpoints of the world. One is Caribbean and another is South American, right? Like but they all get bucketed together because they speak the same language. But it's very important to note the level of variation within these places and the level of, let's just call it what it is, like the United States of America is in a strong position, zoomed out globally, right? Some of these countries can be considered, second and third world. And like, so I said everything I said, and you still have to live in these places and scenarios that are like, they're just poverty stricken. So like everything that comes with that in like, American urban areas or American, like, cities that are impoverished and all those things that you see there, those things are magnified in Latin America. They really do get magnified, and they're more obvious and they're more striking. So the holes from which I think kids have to dig out of just to be seen and showcased, that's like one whole part, and we haven't even gotten to like major league scouts seeing players yet. This is just in like the little leagues of how this thing functions. And it's all transactional, like I don't need to get into details, but it's all transactional.
Yeah.
Like, and so, that happens before a scout even like sees a player, right? So like, okay, we can enter into that part of it, which you're making projections on these kids that like they will change so fundamentally. If Ian Miller were scouted as a 14-year-old kid, like You gonna put a
Dude,
major league projection on this tool?
dude,
Like,
no chance. No
but a
chance.
lot of really good scouts and really good baseball people, they're kind of like being boxed into having to operate in this way because you have to compete. And
Yeah.
one team pushes how early it gets, and then a trail of teams does the same, and now the line has moved. And
Yeah.
so and teams are competitive, right? And like we're all former athletes, we're competing with each other, and so the lines keep going. And I think we're at, I've been thinking we've been at a breaking point for a little while, but this feels like it's entrenched into the system, and that's the third component to this, which I think everybody needs to fundamentally understand. In the United States of America, draft bonuses, like that doesn't take up a big enough part of GDP, for example, to really move anybody's needle nationally. In the Dominican Republic,
Mm-hmm.
you remove the baseball professional player system and change how it functions, like it's anarchy, like it would be chaos because
Yeah.
of how many the web of things that are tied together in it,
Yeah, they're reinvesting
so,
back in the country.
to me, when MLB is like, okay, it's time to do a draft, the draft mitigates a lot of this, and I actually agree with that. I think the draft mitigates a lot of it. It doesn't solve every problem, but it mitigates some of the most egregious problems. But the biggest issue is nobody that's currently benefiting from the system wants it to change in any fundamental way. Like it's like there's no incentive to that changing, but something's going to give at some point because the line just keeps moving to a point of like extremes. But I'm not here to just poo-poo the system. I think at the end of the day, what I want to do is create more opportunities for Latin American players. So I said all this, and again, we haven't put pen to paper yet. We haven't entered the Dominican Academy yet. We haven't entered that. Like, I just want to make it clear that kids in the United States that get to think about and be kids and enjoy whatever the hell you do at 11, 12, 13, 14, all the things that we did, right? That are like core to your youth. Like you get robbed of that. You get robbed of that experience, and then you get put into this really interesting patriarchal dynamic as a really young kid because you earn the money, because now the financial situation is flipped and you're the earner. Now, like you're now the patriarch of your family in a lot of dynamics, especially in like fatherless households,
And communities
so, like,
too.
Big time, big time. So like everything flips, especially if the bonus is like significant. You all of a sudden you become this like target really, and kids don't do things to help themselves, right? So you want to buy a house and you want to buy a car. The problem is in your small little town, that's the thing that puts the biggest target on your back. So you're like highlighting these areas and things for new people to show up and be introduced into your life, and that's a mixed bag, And so, and then you enter the Dominican Academy, and that's a mixed bag too. I'm proud to say that the Marlins have a beautiful academy now, a brand new one. My first 3 years there, it was embarrassing. The things that you expect professional players to develop in a facility like this. And that's a good one. You go to your average training program, not the good ones. Some of the good ones are like SEC programs, some of the best ones, the trainer programs, not the major league ones. And some are, the back of a guy's house, and like 6 guys are staying in like the illegal room he's built in the back room, and like everybody's plugged into one like outlet, and it's like, it's real, man. It's not like trying to dramatize to give the story like, more appeal. It's like, no, that's just the reality of a lot of kids. The average kid experiences that situation. So the average level of expectation is just like, I don't know. I was traveling Venezuela a lot during the year 2017. And in the year 2017, Venezuela was in a terrible political position, like political, economic. The country was like in a failed state almost, like riots throughout the country, and just money didn't work. You couldn't pay for things. It was very strange. But I had to keep going there, and it was like people don't factor that part in too, right? Like you don't know the political strife from the countries that these people are coming from. And then now everybody has to leave home. Any Latin American kid is the biggest mama's boy. The average Latin American kid is the biggest mama's boy, right? And I mean that in a good way. I don't mean that in a bad way. But these kids now, it is their duty. If this goes well, they now leave forever.
It's wild.
Like they just like leave home.
Yep.
And that's just like an expectation. And yeah, you come back in the off season, maybe.
Yeah.
And it's arguable whether you should or shouldn't come back if you're trying to develop an optimal off season plan. Like if you're trying to like really get better, you got to go, Joseph, you got to go to the academy, so that's good. But not everybody goes home to then go, lift and develop at the academy, right? Like if you're going to like random backfield to do a throwing program, okay, well the kid here that's going to drive line all off season, yeah, he's got you beat. He's got you beat by a mile.
100%.
So like those are the things that like we take for granted here that are not so automatic, even at the major league level. Like even off-season programs for high-caliber major league players are suboptimal relative to the average high school development a kid gets by going to the facility that I have here 3 blocks down.
For sure.
It's just a different world. And so I thought it was important to kind of like lay the landscape before even pro ball happens, and then all the complications of pro ball.
It's wild, dude.
And so I'll wrap it up with one example, Ian, right? Like, because this connects all the way to the pro side. You go, like you could probably say you credibly speak and understand some Spanish, right? Like, because you've been around the game long enough.
A little bit.
Right. You can throw your hands up, and I think most guys that have been playing for a long time or in baseball, they can say, like, yeah, I speak a little Spanish. I took some in high school, right? If I rolled into a major league spring training or to a spring training, and I just started to give an advanced presentation on preparing for the pitcher, and I just rolled in Spanish. I just started talking in Spanish, normally didn't slow down, didn't take into account whether or not you understand the, 4-seam, 2-seam distinction in the variation. Like, imagine if I just said all that in Spanish, and I didn't give any context. I'll be like, all right, boys, let's go. And then everybody's just kind of sitting there like, you got to act like you just understood what's going on, but everybody knows you don't.
100%.
And that is the everyday scenario for a Latin American player, even if they speak English, right? Like it's like, and Latin American people are very proud. Like it's not like you're not going to admit that you don't speak English most of the time. So you're going to nod your head, yes, yes, yes. Mm-hmm. And that's why as a translator, my move was always, I'd see them nodding yes, and afterwards I'm pulling back, hey, what did he just say?
Yeah.
And then it's clear, like he was just trying to end that conversation to not be embarrassed by not understanding.
Right.
But this compounds an issue, right? Like it just like, I don't know.
Then you're behind.
This is an area I'm passionate about because I think a perception of Latin American players sometimes is very quickly like laid on them or planted on them without the proper understanding of like, well, peel this back a little bit. This is layered and textured and complicated, and they don't speak the language, man. Like, I don't know how else to get around that. Like, it's hard to understand when you don't understand.
The language barrier, man. That's something that, like, just going to winter ball, right? And more so in Mexico than Puerto Rico, right? So Puerto Rico is, a U.S. territory. So I went over there to San Juan, Puerto Rico, like the capital, right? And it's very, Americanized, dude. I wasn't like in over my head. I could ask people in English. They'd give me answers. But dude, going to Mexico, it was like, okay, that's a little different, man. So like I needed to get on Duolingo for a couple weeks before getting out there to read, like touch on the basics, right. Dude, like freshen up. It's crazy. The different vibes of what you said, Adrian, of like when we say Latin American players, I was extremely ignorant to the fact of grouping Latin American players in that one Latin American title, right? Not, Venezuelan players are different and have a different culture and different upbringing than the Dominican players, than the Mexican players. So like when I kind of got my feet wet in the minor leagues, dude, and I started seeing that different players from different countries have different upbringings, different personalities, different values, different viewpoints, different experiences. It's like, dude, I was able to kind of almost connect a little bit more with them, having an understanding of maybe, where they came from. Okay, dude, they're from Venezuela. Shit might not be great right now, as opposed to like somebody from, Puerto Rico, right? Not, comparing the two. I'm just saying like there's different, journeys from these different like countries, man, these different cultures. So, man, again,
Western Union, just to give you an example, Western Union doesn't really affect your life much, right? Like Western Union, you think about that. In today's day and age, like in the era of Zelle and stuff, like things have changed a little bit. So it's a little easier to move money around. But like sending money via money order, like that was like a weekly duty of mine back in the day as an intern. You would talk about helping them do their taxes and order food, all of that happened. But what I found really interesting was like just how the mechanisms that the kids had to put into place, especially Venezuelans who had to find all these workarounds to get dollars because you couldn't access a dollar.
Yep.
Like, access to the US dollar was at a premium, like a huge premium. So if you had it, you lived good. If you had somebody who could send you dollars, you were in a good spot. If you didn't, really tough. So at that point in time, these kids, and this is before we just raised the minor league salaries. So imagine DSL, GCL, FCL salaries, the things that they would send and leave themselves with was like, not like, how many times I would like come out of pocket just to be like, hey, like you can't do that. Like, just, you know, they're talking about like sending $20.
Yeah.
You know? And it's like,
that was a big deal.
You're like, you're eating like an $8 fee on a money order to pay $20, but that's the reality of what you think you need to do. And that's like you away, not speaking the language, first time away from home, mom or whoever needs everything. And you got to like squeak $20 out there, or $500 or $300. And those are the little things that I think are taken for granted here.
For sure.
You don't think about it here. You like kids from here, they'll like flip on their Uber account, like find an Uber account, start driving Uber and figure something out, right? But like if you don't have residency, you can't get a license. If you can't get a license, you can't do that following part. If you don't have a visa, like it just like, it's a sequence of things that's just,
it's an uphill battle.
I'm not trying to lower the bar, but man, like, does it have to be this, you know?
Yeah, it's wild.
You know?
And you,
like,
you got to try to perform and get to the big leagues on top of that, right?
Yeah.
Like, Joseph, you see
it. How come you didn't hit today? How come you didn't hit today? You know?
Exactly.
Like,
just trying
why
to
aren't
survive.
you smiling today? Why aren't you happy and like, you know, showing good body language today? It's like, well, I don't know, because things suck right now. And I missed dinner for whatever reason, you know?
And I think with the new minor league CBA, it's definitely helped a lot because now they don't have to pay for the housing. But before, these kids in the DSL had to pay rent every month. So like that little check that they had, like it was even smaller. You know, they'd have to pay the academy for the food, whatever it was, the food and the, you know, like the dorm and I'm not sure if they're doing that there still, but I know here in the States they're covering the housing and spring training. You know, they wouldn't get paid. Instructs, some teams would get paid, some wouldn't. So they're just there like enjoying their meals and practicing and just trying to, you know, move up. And another thing too is like Big League Advance, right? So this company that Tatis did and he used it and now they're taking a big chunk, but there's guys in Latin America that are like, dude, I would do that in a heartbeat. Like I have nothing. I don't care what they take from. They're like, my grandma's dying. My sister is sick, you know, like I'll do anything for it. And it's interesting to see those perspectives because you don't expect to hear that. But when you're in those situations, you know, or some of them, you know, they have a kid already and they're 20 years old and they have a 2-year-old back home in whatever country. So it's like, people would criticize them for doing it, but it's like, you don't know how they're feeling about things. And they're just trying to be square, right? They're just trying to be able to go to the field and not worry about those things. And it's really tough on those guys, you know, and they go through a lot, not only culturally, but like just mentally. They have to be, they're adults a lot sooner. You know, here in the States, you get drafted, for the most part, you have your parents' support, you know, you're here, you know, if you get released, you can go back home. Like, you know, with them, it's like they might not be able to go back home. They need to find something else they can do here or try to get a job with the organization. You know,
I seen that and it blew my mind, bro. So I was in rookie ball and he was from the Dominican. And he had, I guess it was the end of the year. It was time for him to go home. And he had gotten his flight to New York, connecting flight, and he just didn't make his second flight. And he started a new life in New York, like just because that's where the opportunity was at the time. And I might be pretty sure he's from the Dominican, man. I don't want to misspeak because now I'm questioning in myself, was he from Venezuela? But just thinking about the opportunities and like it was time for him to go home. It was time for him to go home. Baseball might have been dwindling for him. And he's like, you know what, dude, I need to stay here. I think he ended up getting a job as like a car mechanic, like just starting a new life in New York, dude, having to start over. It's crazy to think about, man. It's crazy, like the uphill battles, the struggles that these guys, before they even get signed, have to go through. And they have to like mature so young. I couldn't even imagine having to make an evaluation, let alone a potentially multi-million-dollar decision on an 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old and try to be like, okay, dude, he could fit this ceiling or this role. It's absolutely mind-blowing. And then to magnify it with potentially, 7 figures worth of a signing bonus, like, dude, that magnifies all problems you have. Like, regardless, like it makes more people come out of the woodwork. It makes the problems bigger.
Friends.
That's absolutely crazy. So we've seen, go ahead, Adrian. I don't want to.
I was wondering if I could have an opportunity to just like provide a counter, or not a counter, but also just like in all fairness, like I do believe that there's a lot of really good people and efforts, like grinding it out to like do things and push this game forward in Latin America. And I mean that from the club side. I mean that from the agent side and trainer side. I mean that from the MLB side. I guess what I'm saying is, like, there's a lot of well-intentioned people that kind of, when it comes to this system, are just kind of like frustrated and throwing their hands up because the system has been like, when this big monolith of a system is moving in a direction, in order to get it to stop and turn on a dime into something fundamentally different, it's like, it's just way easier to let that thing keep moving a little bit until it just gets to that boiling point. And I don't know when that is. I do think that the efforts to instill a draft are genuine. And I do think that while wrought with complications, and they're going to get it, it's not going to get it perfect the first, second, third year of those drafts. And there's going to be a growing pain period for everybody once they decide to do it. But, there's been such resistance to that from directions that you wouldn't expect, right? Like, so the resistance I saw coming a lot from the major league player pool, because those are who the cameras are on, right? That's who the reporters talk to. It's like, oh no, we don't want the draft. We're like, yeah, but that the system, that you hated the system that you came up in, right? So that wasn't good, but you just think like, no, well, I know the draft isn't good, and it's, to me, it's more complicated than that. I think that discussion is worth having out in the open to get to, but there's a concept that I think they want to execute. I think I'm highlighting the fact that the system has gone so far in a direction that even like the best of people and the best of intentions, it's hard to like, make it easier. And you limit the player pool, so it shrinks to 165. So how does that affect the Latin American kid, right? So it affects them in a few ways. And Joseph, you mentioned it, but fundamentally speaking, they took their first whack at that number. So that number went from 180 to 165. So you're like, 15 spots, 3 guys per roster on the U.S. side. Like, does that really make a difference? Okay, fine. What they didn't do, and they wanted to do, it seems like, was to limit a team's ability to have multiple complex level teams.
Yep.
So that's the other major component here. Like, teams that have multiple complex level teams have an additional roster spot.
Like
now,
DSL1, DSL2.
Exactly.
Okay.
ACL1, ACL2, FCL1, FCL2, green, blue, whatever. They divide it up. And I think the teams a while ago that understood this is a volume-based approach, that's why you see guys from all over the bonus spectrum get there, because it comes from all, but if the next step of this whole process is teams can only have one complex level team, that will neuter Latin American baseball in a way that I think people don't realize. That will stop the growth in this like very fundamental way.
I agree.
And it's like a thing people are not. So here's what happens, right? Like the Marlins had a 2 DSL team structure. And I like that a little better than the 2 FCL or the 2 stateside. Both have pros and cons, right? But in the DSL, I think a lot of kids need that time there before they're ready for stateside competition. They're just too young, too inexperienced, too raw. Like they need that level, right? But there's a new rule, and this, I don't know if people know, but I think it started in 2023. Once you get sent up, you really can't go back. It has to be like extraordinary circumstances for you to get option back to the DSL. They're really, really discouraging it. So what does that mean? That means a team stateside is going to be way more reluctant to pull that first trigger out of the DSL.
Mhm.
They're not going to aggressively promote out of there if they feel he might fall on his face. And now you're really talking about a release discussion as opposed to a demotion discussion.
It's happening a lot now.
And it just like flips real fast like that. And
Mhm.
if they get there to the States and don't have immediate success, you could be in that pool very quickly. Because now you just drafted 25 new players in June, July, and where do they play? You think the third rounder is not going to get priority time over the guy recently promoted?
For sure.
So I really hope that next level isn't okay. Now reduce the complex level teams too, because that will slow the growth of Latin American baseball in a major way, and I don't think people are thinking about that.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought it up because it's really relevant, you know.
I
And
love
it
it.
bottlenecks, so it creates like this bottleneck effect right at the complex level
Right.
and so like the more advanced players are getting the promotion, but the Latin American player that needs that time is kind of in this weird in between.
That's
And-
wild, man.
Yeah, and to go off that too, you're talking about guys like Ronald Acuna, Ellie De La Cruz. Those guys signed for Acuna was 100. De La Cruz, I think he signed for 55K.
No way.
Yeah, so those guys don't make it out of the complex. You know what I mean? Like you don't know, like if they're
Can't figure them
limited,
out.
if they're limited and they're not progressing how they think right away. I mean, the timeline is shortened a lot, even for drafted players. There's players that were drafted or signed last year that aren't performing now. They're releasing them.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's wild, man.
it's a lot faster. The turnaround, I mean, the turnover rather is much more. But you know, Ellie De La Cruz and Acuna, like look at those guys how they developed. You know, they signed with minimal bonuses, and you wouldn't think that they'd become superstars. But you know, a lot of it in baseball is that mental and that heart for the game too that you can't really measure with all these analytics and data points. So
Definitely.
You need to have such an outlier performance wise or season wise to put yourself in consideration for a promotion, as opposed to a drafted player. There's almost like a more natural flow of like, okay, you played A ball last year, now you're older and you go to high A ball. Like the Latin American player especially in those early phases, you have to kill the DSL to get out of there, and then you have to kill the complex to establish yourself as a prospect. You know, again, we don't need the bar to be lowered. It's just like all these things make it so that this isn't the deck is stacked a little bit differently, and it's okay to say that. It's okay to acknowledge that, because what I hope happens here is that the player pool, right? The American stateside player pool develops at least some level of empathy, you know, not sympathy necessarily, but just like empathy for like, yo, this shit's hard for these guys, man. Like they're taking into consideration all these different things, and then they don't understand the average person that talks to them and like their coach, they're probably getting 40% of what's being said. Their like pitching coordinator, like, what do you think those mound visits are like? You think those mound visits are like, you think like things are being discussed that are, if there isn't an interpreter, you know, like,
which they're usually not.
I
Still,
always think about this in a mound visit where I'm like, you know, this is high leverage situation. Like we're talking about a big decision, and I know this guy doesn't speak Spanish, and I know this guy's comprehension of English is limited at best, right?
Yeah.
And guys get out of that, and guys get better, and guys learn to speak English, and guys establish themselves and put themselves in great positions to stay in the States or go back to their countries. So like, I don't want to say, you know, it's hard for everybody and nobody, like, no, guys, when you put things at a more even level, so like when they get to the big leagues, regardless of where they signed, that's like the first even playing field. I don't think they get that very much until like the AAA level, maybe like big league level, where you finally like hit even, and now you can, you know, you can compete tool versus tool.
Yeah.
You know,
That makes
before
sense.
that point, it's a lot more like complex. Like the deck is stacked a little differently.
100%, man. No, it makes a ton of sense. I appreciate you guys being here. I appreciate your time. So I'll just, you know, hit you guys with one last question before we get out of here, man. So, Joseph, you had alluded to, you know, the CBA, the current state of, you know, man, there are rule changes that are happening, right? So they're limiting, you know, at first it's, you know, 180 to 165. Like they're eliminating spots. They're you know, limiting teams, man. It's just becoming harder and harder to have a job. You know, minor league players are starting to get paid more. There's rule changes, man. They're changing the sizes of the bags, right? It just seems like the game's changing. You know what I mean? And it might be for the better because we're seeing, viewership, I guess, go up a little bit. The demographic of people that are in stadiums and that are watching and consuming the game, the finished product, is getting younger. So they are making the game, quote unquote, sexier to the younger generation. That's what they want, man, right? They wanted it to be, I guess, maybe a little sped up. They wanted to put more butts in seats, right? Like, what do you think right now, Joseph, being on the agent side of things? Like, the game's changing, right? We got rule changes, pitch clock, pickoff attempts, all that stuff. In your opinion, man, what do you think of the state of the game right now? Is it moving in the right direction? Like, is the best product being put out there on the field right now, man? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I mean, when you go all the way back to the minor league system with Brent Rickey, he had a ton of teams, right? And then like the cream of the crop would rise, and that would be it. Now we're seeing the opposite. Now it's like more of a focus group, and guys. I mean, there's college dudes now that they don't make it in a 20-round draft that 5 years ago they would have for sure been drafted. But now were those guys just fillers, right? Were they just helping the other guys develop? And they were basically, using these guys. And for years, right, they didn't get a real job. They're thinking they're going to move up, and they were just fillers. Unfortunately, now there's not so much of that, but the leash is a lot shorter. And you're just
portal.
yeah, it's a lot shorter, man, and it's different. It's different. And the draft, I feel like they try to fill like those big primary positions, right? They're trying to fill those guys with experience, and these fringy like college guys. A fringy college guy is like a guy that hits like 340 with 15 homers now. Like that's a fringe college guy, like there's
Wild, bro.
and then you look at different conferences, you look at the SEC and the ACC and the Big 12, they're taking president. I mean, they're the ones taking the front seat of the draft. And then the other thing too is like these guys get to Arizona or Florida after they're drafted, and some of them have to play rookie ball because there's no space. So they have to play rookie ball for a couple of weeks until they can release somebody or move somebody. So in a way, it's good for those players that are in there. They're focusing more on their development. But on the other hand, if you struggle, it's gonna be a short career for you.
That makes sense.
Fortunately, that's what's happening. They're not giving any time. Or like these guys aren't performing. See you later. And Latin American kids are starting to take more of a front seat because they're younger, they're developing, and when you have a 21-year-old that's doing the same thing that a 24-year-old's doing with similar numbers, they're going to keep the 21-year-old.
For sure.
Average age has dropped tremendously in the last 5 years in the big leagues.
That makes sense. Adrian, excuse me. What do you got, man? What like the state of the game going on right now? How do you feel? How do you feel baseball is right now, man? Is it what you want to see? Is it where it should be? Is it trending in the right direction, man? What's your take on that before we get out of here?
Yes and no, but I'm hopeful that it could be yes and yes, right? Like, so I say that because yes, I think it was the correct move to move in the direction of a better pace to the game. Like talk to any scout, and I talk to a lot of scouts, like they love that the games are quicker now. It's just like a better, like any outfielder will tell you they love the pace of the game now. Any fan feels that same, like whether or not you agree with this era of TikTok and social media that we're in, people expect information in short bits of time. Like you extend that out, like you start to lose more people. You want to get younger, you need to like lean in a little bit. And I don't think I have liked that direction. I like the limitation of the shift, right? Like I think we got to too much of a.
I agree.
I'm not I love analytics. I love diving in and working analytics into scouting processes. I love data. I love sports science. I love that kind of thing. But I remember I worked a lot of advanced stuff. So I remember thinking, like watching the shift, like you can kind of map out what's going to happen. Like right matchup, sinker baller with actual run, you stack it, you stack the left side of the infield, and like in the big leagues, like most balls that are hit on the ground are outs, the vast majority. But in the shift days, the shift allowable days, it was just like I think Sandy Alcantara was one of the most interesting examples from the Cy Young year to the next year, people are like, well, the drop off in stuff and this and that. And I'm like, yeah, bro, but the shift was eliminated in between all that. So like a soft contact inducing pitcher in a year where you put your shortstop wherever you want. So you have your best fielder in the most ideal position. And so like that's one area that I think like now it's like more athletically based. Now it's more like out completion is like there's a higher degree of difficulty placed on that. So like now run times to first have all of a sudden gotten better because you smell a hit a lot earlier, than you do. So you give a little bit extra effort. And I like the base stealing. I like that they limited how much pitchers can like, hold, pause, pick over, like, because that kind of stuff limits there's a reason people boo that kind of stuff,
Yeah,
like,
man.
Nobody likes it. Like it's an inherent, you don't know why you're booing, you're just doing it. So like
For sure.
the more baseball works in a direction of like eliminating its antiquities without losing its identity and integrity, I think that's all for the better. I think a natural correction had to happen. You mentioned Branch Rickey, and I'm really glad you did. At the beginning, it had to be 5 levels of the minor leagues, like this big whole thing to draw out just a few players. Now, as we've gotten professional and as we've gotten better, I think there's been less and less of a need of so many like rookie A, Midwest League, high A, double A, triple A, and then you go. When right now in the draft room, they tell you that the SEC is probably comparable to like high A, maybe good double A or low double A.
Yep.
Whatever. Don't hold me to that projection, but like that's what you're doing in your, okay, he did this in the SEC.
Yeah, no,
like this in high A, right? So like that tells me that there's the modern system hasn't caught up to like how efficiently players are being developed now relative to how they were in the 60s. We still have the same amount of teams that we did in 60s, 70s, but now like it's a more efficient process. So same pool of players, but like you can go from high A to the big leagues. You can go from double A to the big leagues now. And I'd argue that this is a natural progression. We needed less total levels. Like for a real dude, if you're like, you probably really only need to prove it at complex, high A, triple A, and then you're good. Like you've checked your boxes at that point, right? This was due, and I think what's going to happen, we're going to see an interesting correction, right? Like I think we're going to see, because of the portal and this new NIL space that we're operating in, it's allowing players to keep playing a little longer. And then I think the pro scouting process through the indie ball identification or through the players that get released too soon that decide to continue trying or to continue finding a way back in, there will be like minor league free agency opportunities that still, because you're eliminating a pool, but teams still have needs for these, Ian, what you did as a player, right? Like somebody still needs to go defend and do things like at the major league level. Not that that's all you did, but you know what I'm saying, right?
For
like
sure.
There's still
For sure.
roles that need to happen. So I think it's due for that correction. I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but I'd really like for things to return to a little more of a human baseball experience, right? Like I aside from the strike zone, I think the strike zone, it's just like we're in this era, it makes sense, like automate it, like let's just get past this part, like I know that there's a union issue with the umpires, we don't want to eliminate jobs and things like that, but like everybody in America is looking at that little box, and when it's outside the box, everybody's like, we're living in this like weird reality of like, we already have it, let's just do it.
No kidding. No kidding.
And so what I mean by that, aside from that, I think we've just like turned so hard in the direction of models and algorithms making every decision that like it can be, at least from within a front office, it can also almost be like, man, this isn't as fun as it is when you're like making a subjective scouting decision, and there's like, and then just like the model, the inputs just like make your decision. And I think this shows up on, I don't want to, it shows up on the service time thing with me all the time, right? Like I'm ready to get past this era of artificially keeping guys anywhere, artificially keep, like if you're 19 years old and you're the talented dude, why is the system incentivized to like not let you show your talent at that level if you're there, and if you could be aggressive about that, promotion? or vice versa. Like if you want to field an older team, you should be able to do those things, right?
Yeah.
But like, I get fired up about and I'm not picking on the Marlins, I'm really not, but like Max Meyer getting demoted not too long ago, he makes a couple great starts in the big leagues, gets like, and then the game happens. The game immediately happens where it's like the option down to AAA, we're managing the workload, he just came off Tommy John, we need to do this, but damn, dude, you're sitting in that kid's seat, he just pitched his ass off, he just worked his ass off to get back from Tommy John, he shoves in the big leagues for 2 outings, and now I'm back to AAA. I'm sorry, but that's not going to go over well with anybody, any player, no matter how well you explain it to him. He's not going to sit here and be like, on a team that's 4 and whatever, right now, and I'm not picking on them, I promise. It's not like I love the Marlins, but I'm saying like until we get to this point where this isn't a thing that we do anymore as an industry, I think I won't enjoy this process as much because I hated being in those. I hated that like kid comes up, covers your whole bullpen on a night you got murdered before, so you used your whole pen. And then the kid who you sent up from AAA just wears it for 4 innings, and he's just like taking it on the chin for 7 earned runs and did it for you, wore it for you. And then he's got to like tail between his legs, walk into the manager's office and be like, hey, you're going down to AAA. And it's just like, I've seen the demoralization, man.
Yeah.
It was like the shoulder, like, and I could just never get on the side of that. But as a front office, you're kind of like, if I were to take that position, you'd be taking a very much against the grain position.
For sure.
Like, well, it's not efficient. There's all sorts of arguments to argue like future projections and why, the age sweet spot needs to be hit in this window. And that's the part of the game that I feel, I hope, I don't know if it could regress to something other than what it is. I think it just kind of moves in this direction, but it has shifted like dramatically, in my opinion, now in these last 2 to 3 years where everything is very model driven. And I used to be on the other side of this, like, hey, the models like absorb information, lean into information, but like everything's cyclical, man. And I think we're in that cycle of like, it's going to correct itself at some point. And I think we're in the overcorrection phase.
Makes sense.
In my opinion.
Yeah.
Makes sense. That makes sense.
So,
I love that.
Sorry, just to add like but Latin American baseball, just to wrap it up, right? Like I am so excited about because the trajectory is like this, right? Like the growth culturally, if you do like social media analytics, if you do like Latin American baseball growth is significant. And that's that the majority of their players don't really get marketed. And it's not the fault of MLB, it's just like, you think of Acuna and you think of like De La Cruz, but like, man, there's a million guys that are so interesting and so like appealing and so like that because of the language barrier, because of wherever they're from, you just don't get that access to them. But what people don't realize, when you post something on Latin American MLB baseball account in Latin America, look at those numbers. Look at those analytics and look at those numbers and tell me that like Latin America isn't a major baseball population.
For sure.
Watch the WBC.
For sure, yeah.
We haven't even touched Asia yet, right? We haven't even talked about Asian, and like that's a whole conversation for a whole other podcast, it seems, which is fascinating too. But
definitely,
yeah, that's how I feel about the game. But I think that there are things that could be done, and in short order to keep moving. And I think people are doing that. It's just collective bargaining is a thing, man. Like people have strong. No offense to your guys' side of the ball. But like there are strongly held positions that both sides feel like they can't move or set precedents.
Yep.
And even though there are forces within those sides that believe certain things like to their core, the collective pressures don't allow them to really either express that opinion or have that opinion be brought to the forefront. It's kind of like you have to stay in this camp, and it's labor, right? So like labor is never easy. Labor negotiations at the end of the day are notoriously, I mean, Jimmy Hoffa and like all this era that we went through in America, like labor's tough. And that's why this issue is tough, because you have to go through CBA. Ironically, you could switch the draft from 40 to 20 rounds without needing a CBA adjustment, but the international draft, it needs CBA. I think that's an interesting irony there. But
good point,
man. We went to a 5-round draft in COVID and then to a 20-round draft after.
Pretty easily.
But international can't change because that's bargained. So that's a weird you know, it's
I
it's
love
Yes.
that.
so
Definitely
Makes
a
sense.
lot to that. Yeah.
yeah.
Makes sense, man. Makes sense, boys. I am so thankful for your time here today. Man, I'm just wrapping in on an hour and a half, man. I appreciate your guys' viewpoints, the stories, the facts, the opinions. It's fantastic. It's going to be absolutely electric for the nine hole audience to just see this and see things from your point of view. Get educated on baseball outside of the United States, the trials, the tribulations, the processes that go into it, and just, man, hopefully, I know I'm grateful for hearing your guys' viewpoints and your journey in the game, what you've seen. I know my audience is going to feel the same way. So I appreciate you guys, Adrian, Joseph, man. Thank you guys for your time. Thank you guys for coming on here and let me run you guys through the gauntlet on the Nine Hope podcast. And man, thank you. I hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll see everybody back here tomorrow. Thank you, fellas, for your time, man.
Appreciate it. Thank
Yes,
you.
sir. Take care, fellas.